Welcome to Chatting the Pictures. My name is Cara Finnegan, and I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw. I'm a writer, a psychologist, and also publisher of Reading the Pictures.
It may not have drawn a lot of media attention, but the weather event in Iowa last week was staggering.
This photo was taken by Daniel Acker for Getty Images in Luther, Iowa on August 11th. It shows grain storage bins damaged by a massive weather event called a Derecho. These severe winds, another indication of the heightening climate crisis, destroyed up to 1/4 of Iowa's crop yield.
The Derecho has been described as a land hurricane, and I think that's the best analogy that I've heard for helping us all understand what this storm was. This was not a tornado that blows through town and leaves devastation in its wake, but then is quickly gone. This lasted for many hours across a very large swath of the Midwest, and it really was catastrophic. These are grain bins. Grain bins store grain. You see them knocked over here. You see a certain amount of grain spilled. So that's last year's harvest, which you store until you sell and move it on. And then now we also have in the very lower left this year's crop. And you get a little bit of a sense of the damage to crops, which was devastating. And then when you look at the land laid out behind these grain bins, again, this beautiful aerial view of this completely flat space of agricultural landscape, you get the sense of what's going to happen with next year's crop. This is an image that, for me, as someone who lives in flyover land, it actually invites us to think not only about this moment and the kind of aesthetic drama of this moment, but it also really invites us to think about the past, the present, and the future as they're all connected to this terrible storm.
This photograph really does represent beauty and misery. I saw plenty of people on social media relating to this photograph in its comparison to a Frank Gehry building, such as the one with the beautiful steel twisted effect in Bilbao. The photograph, especially with this orientation, the perfect view from the drone, really beckons that kind of aestheticizing. It is another example of how do you represent or wrap your head around severe climate and climate change. This event was not completely unique. I think there's been something on the order of 40 or 50 of these in the last 100 years, but there's a lot of people that had never heard of them. And this one was particularly forceful. The winds were up to 140 miles per hour. And by the way, this didn't even make it into the media landscape with all of the concern right now about politics and the election and the pandemic. But when you talk about climate and you talk about an event of this scale and multiple events that are happening at a greater scale this year, and then you put that on top of the pandemic and the trade war that has really caused so much pain in the Midwest, this photo is much harder to wrap your head around.
A year or so ago, you could drive down fields that look very much like this, where you saw these giant mounds, and that was soybeans that had to wait in the fields because these similar kinds of grain bins were full and no one could sell because of the trade wars. Even though this image is unpopulated, you definitely get that sense of a community and a town as you look off to the upper right of the image, where you see what looks to me like a very typical Midwestern white church in a small Midwestern town. So you get the sense that these are communities where not only the storm, but that cumulative impact of these things that have happened is going to have an impact on the people in those tiny houses and the people who attend that church and drive on these roads and who work in these industries.